Major developments today in the war on Ukraine. U.S. President Donald Trump has spoken to the leaders of both Russia and Ukraine, and he says negotiations to end the three-year-old conflict are set to begin right away. CBC's Richard Madden has more on this now. He joins us from Washington. And Richard, what do we know about these two phone calls which Trump had with Putin and Zelensky?
Yeah, well, President Trump himself describing these calls as, quote, highly productive. He also said negotiations to end Russia's bloody war in Ukraine would end, in his words, immediately, adding that all three parties agreed to work closely to resolve the conflict. Now, the Kremlin says Russian President Vladimir Putin and Trump spoke for an hour and a half. Trump says his separate call afterwards with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky lasted about an hour. And it's worth noting that this is the first known call between President Trump and Putin since Trump began his second term. Now, Trump raised the prospect of brokering a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine. He also revealed both he and Putin are planning to have a face-to-face meeting together, starting on neutral territory, but perhaps eventually a visit to each other's home countries. Watch.
I'll be dealing with President Putin largely on the phone, and we ultimately expect to meet. In fact, we expect that he'll come here and I'll go there, and we're going to meet also probably in Saudi Arabia. The first time we'll meet in Saudi Arabia, see if we can get something done. But we want to end that war. That war is a disaster.
So no dates officially on the books for this planned meeting, but Trump continued to discuss that war. He said part of the Ukrainian territory is already lost to Russia, and it's unlikely the Russians will give it back. Trump was also asked specifically if he viewed Ukraine as an equal partner in these negotiations. And it was notable that Trump sidestepped answering, saying Ukraine and Russia both want peace. Now, Ukraine's President Zelensky posting he's willing to talk, saying, and I'm quoting here, "No one wants peace more than Ukraine. Together with the U.S., we are charting our next steps to stop Russian aggression and ensure a lasting, reliable peace." As President Trump said, quote, "Let's get it done." Now, Trump has since tasked his vice president and secretary of state to lead negotiations to resolve the Russia-Ukraine war. And their first meeting takes place Friday at the upcoming security summit in Zurich. But at this point, it's unclear who will be part of the envoy representing Russia and Ukraine. I also want to add here, Dwight, Trump may have given a slight preview of his peace plan. He says Ukraine has already agreed to give the U.S. critical minerals, oil and gas in exchange for their security. So we'll see if anything more comes from that. And of course, what stems from the U.S. envoy leading those negotiations later this week.
Richard, earlier today, the new U.S. Secretary of Defense made some comments about the war in Ukraine that seemed to be a shift in U.S. policy. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, it is a shift, but it's not unexpected. Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary, also implied some of Ukraine's territory is already lost to the Russians. But he went on, telling NATO's allies earlier today that in his words, it's unrealistic to think Ukraine's borders would return to its pre-war status before Russia invaded Crimea back in 2014. He also said the U.S. would not support Ukraine joining the alliance. In other words, they don't want Ukraine to join NATO, even though this is what Zelensky was pushing for as part of his earlier negotiation demands to end the war. Take a listen to Pete Hegseth.
We want, like you, a sovereign and prosperous Ukraine. But we must start by recognizing that returning to Ukraine's pre-2014 borders is an unrealistic objective. Chasing this illusionary goal will only prolong the war and cause more suffering.
So this positioning by the U.S. may have given up a bit of leverage to negotiate with Russia, but as I mentioned earlier, Dwight, it doesn't come as a surprise. Many NATO countries were expecting the U.S. to dial back its support for Ukraine since Trump's election victory. And it's also worth noting that Hegseth is not pausing America's military aid to Ukraine from the previous Biden administration. So it is a significant policy shift, not unexpected, but clearly the Trump administration is taking aim now at looking to resolve this war, this bloody war between Russia and Ukraine.
CBC's Richard Madden in Washington. Thank you, Richard.
You bet.
Let's take a deeper look now with Walter Dorn. He is a professor of defense studies at Royal Military College of Canada, and he joins us from Toronto this evening. Professor, Trump's conversation with both leaders ending in agreement to begin negotiations to end the war. I want to get your thoughts on what this might actually mean, especially for Ukraine.
Right. Well, first of all, there should be no negotiations about Ukraine without Ukraine. So Ukraine will have to be the key negotiator. The U.S. can't do it on behalf of Ukraine, but they certainly can encourage both sides. And the big concern is that Trump will try and negotiate a deal with Putin and then impose that on Ukraine. But it should be a sovereign Ukraine that decides whether it wants to give up any territory, which I don't think it would be just for Ukraine to reward aggression by giving up sovereign territory. But Ukraine might need to recognize that Russia does occupy parts of its territory, and it might have to recognize Russian control of certain territory. So in these complicated ceasefire and peace negotiations, we'd like to see that there's some justice so that aggression is not rewarded.
Yeah, and I think that's the issue here, that it seems like Russia is being rewarded. How do you feel about them playing this card now, saying that, don't worry about it, Putin, they're not going to be joining NATO? Like, giving that up so early, isn't that part of the negotiation for Zelensky?
Exactly. So as a negotiating position, that's what Russia's opening negotiation position is. And for the U.S. to say it at day one is really a step backward for the Ukrainian position. However, I think we do have to be realistic that putting NATO forces into Ukraine or having Ukraine join formally as a NATO member is a huge step, which comes with great risk. Because if Russia and Ukraine were to engage in some tit for tat, then we could find NATO, and that means us, at war with Russia. And so this joining of NATO should be something that is done very carefully, and probably the negotiations will push it to the future when there's a more peaceful Russia.
I mean, this does come down to land and the feeling, I guess, by Putin that Ukraine's not a real country, etc. Trump told Zelensky to give up hope of taking back all of the land Russia has seized. Do you envision any deal where Ukraine maybe not get territory back, but at least gets to keep what it has now?
Oh, I don't think Ukraine will give up any of its territory that it currently has. But
even
Russia
the Russian parts, because Russia's maybe trade for some of the Kursk region, like a trade of some of they've occupied. Sure. Yeah.
Yes, the Ukrainians will want to give up the area that they occupy in Kursk for regions that they would want. I mean, they would like to sever the land bridge that Russia now has between Donbass and Crimea, and they'll try and get some way to break that bridge. But the main thing is that Ukrainians don't want to be in Russia. They just want to use it as a bargaining chip and as a means to take away Russian troops. So there are fewer Russian troops attacking Ukrainians inside Ukraine.
How likely is it that we'll see an end to all of this maybe by the end of this year?
I don't know if we'll see an end by the end of this year, but I think that we'll see a ceasefire, or at least several ceasefires, probably a ceasefire that's broken and then it's reestablished, and we'll start to see peace negotiations so that the ceasefire can lead to something more lasting.
Walter Dorn is a professor of defense studies at the Royal Military College of Canada. Thank you for this, Professor. We might talk again as this continues to develop.
Okay, thank you, Dwight.